the blood soaking into the warped floorboards of the cabin, didn't trouble Maeve Sullivan. It was the snow mud the man dragged in that made her clench her teeth. When you're a widow feeding 2 children on thin broth and prayers deep in the Appalachian Mountains in the winter at 6:03 in 1929, a dying stranger isn't a tragedy, he's just one more mouth you can't afford. The December wind in West Virginia didn't blow. It clawed. It dragged its teeth across the tin roof of the cabin hunting for a way in, and Maeve had long since learned to plug every gap with rags and sheer stubbornness. She'd been a nurse once, before the coal mine swallowed her husband and left her with a stack of hospital bills. A little boy who coughed through the night with asthma and with only a medicine bottle scraped down to its last dregs. So when young Cormac came running home saying there was something like a dead animal down by the frozen creek, the first thing Maeve thought of wasn't compassion. It was meat. It was survival. But what lay beneath the snow wasn't an animal. It was a big man wrapped in an expensive wool coat now torn to ribbons, Italian leather shoes caked with dried blood, black hair gone prematurely gray at the temples, and a long scar running the length of his jaw. He'd been stabbed, then grazed by a bullet, and he was dying slow in the snow. Maeve knelt. Her cracked hands slid into the lining of his coat, and her fingers brushed something that set her heart pounding, a thick fold of paper money. Enough to clear her debt, enough to buy her son's medicine all winter, and a gold ring engraved with the crest of a world she couldn't begin to understand. She could take it and walk away. He'd never know. A dead man is useless, but a living man owes you. What Maeve had no way of knowing, as she set the money back and decided to haul that heavy man up the icy hill, was that she'd just saved one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Chicago. A boss whose name made the whole city flinch, and that the cold stranger, whispering a dead woman's name in his fever, was about to change her life and her children's lives forever. If you love stories about the quiet strength of a mother and the secrets buried beneath the snow, hit that like button to support us. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that kindness still matters. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a tale of courage, survival, and the bonds nobody saw coming. Maeve did not allow herself to hesitate for even one more second. She pulled the wooden door from the firewood shed, the door whose hinges had come loose since last autumn, and dragged it through the snow to where the man lay. The only rope she had left was the one she still used to tie bundles of wood, frayed and stiff with frost, but it would have to do. She threaded the rope through the 2 holes cut into the edge of the door, wrapped it around his chest, and tied a knot with hands so numb she could barely feel them. He was absurdly heavy. The first time she pulled the rope taut, his whole body did not move, as though she were trying to drag the entire hill after her. Cormac stood behind her, his small shoulders pressed against the wood, his red hands clinging to the edge of the door. "Don't look at his face," Maeve said, her voice dry and flat. "Just push. Push steadily. Don't stop." The boy nodded, his lips pressed tight together, and they began to climb. Every step was a battle of its own. Maeve's boots slipped over the mud that had frozen into ridges hard as stone, and each time she lost her balance, the rope dug deeper into her palms through the thin canvas gloves. She felt her skin tear somewhere beneath the cloth, but she did not dare stop to look. Her breath rose in broken white clouds in the air, and her chest burned each time she drew breath, as though she were swallowing mouthfuls of crushed glass. Her back screamed. A line of pain ran from her lower spine up between her shoulder blades. A red-hot rope stretched beneath her skin, and she knew that by morning she would not be able to stand straight. But morning was another problem, a problem for another woman, not the woman dragging a living corpse up the hill right now. That groan was the only thing reminding her that she was not wasting herself pulling a dead body. He was alive. He still owed life something. She clung to that thought the way she clung to the rope, and kept pulling. The snow began falling harder, small sharp flakes landing on her neck, melting into cold water that slipped down inside her collar. Cormac coughed, a dry burst of coughing breaking through his ragged breaths, and Maeve heard it more clearly than the wind, more clearly than the pounding of her own heart in her ears. "Go inside," she said. "Let me pull." "You can't pull him by yourself," the boy answered, his voice thick with cold and stubbornness, the very stubbornness he had inherited from her. "I'm strong," she did not argue. She had no breath left for arguing. They continued inch by inch, the wooden door scraping over the frozen snow like a creature crying out. At one point, some hidden wheel of fate seemed to jam in place. The the door catching on a tree root buried beneath the snow, and Maeve had to throw her whole body into the rope, digging both feet into the ground, grinding her teeth so hard she thought they might crack, until the wood lurched free and they inched forward again. She did not know how long it had been. Time dissolved like snow. It might have been 2 hours. It might have been longer. The light had changed by the time they finally reached the flat patch of ground in front of the house, the sky shifting from lead gray to the bruised purple of a winter dusk. Maeve dropped the rope and fell to one knee on the porch, her chest heaving, her whole body shaking beyond control, partly from exhaustion, partly from the cold that only now began to seep inward once her body had stopped moving. She shoved the door open with her shoulder, the hinges letting out a long, piercing cry in the stillness, and then came the hardest part, getting him across the threshold. She could not lift him. She could only roll him, little by little, off the wooden door, over the raised sill, and into the dim room warmed faintly by smoke. He fell into the house like a broken tree. Maeve grabbed the 2 sides of his buffalo hide coat and dragged him across the floor, each hard pull making both her shoulders feel as if they were about to tear from their sockets, until she managed to get him to the only bed in the house, her own bed, and with one last effort that she did not know where she found, she managed to heave him onto it. The bed frame creaked under his weight, and the woven ropes beneath the mattress sagged until they nearly touched the floor. Maeve took one step back, then another, until her back met the icy wooden wall. She stared at him lying there, taking up the whole bed, filling the little room with the heavy fact of his presence, his wheezing breath pulling in and dragging out, and she did not feel heroic at all. She felt angry. She had just brought another burden into her house, another mouth. A strange man now lying in the only place she had to sleep, and as the darkness thickened around her, Maeve Sullivan wondered what this wretched kindness would cost her in the end. Maeve lit the oil lamp on the shelf, turned the wick as high as she dared, because oil too was something she did not have much of, and carried it to the head of the bed. The trembling yellow light spilled over the man's face, revealing the features that snow and darkness had hidden outside. She took her cutting knife, the blade dull but still able to cut, and began slicing down the length of the buffalo hide coat, stiff with blood and frost. The thick hide stubbornly resisted every stroke, and she had to press down with both hands, drawing the blade forward in short sections until she could peel the coat away from his shoulders. Beneath it was another layer, and it was this layer that made Maeve stop, her fingers suspended in the air. It was a linen shirt, made from the kind of fine, thin fabric she had seen only once in her life, on the body of a gentleman passing through town back when she still worked at the hospital. This was not the cloth of a hunter, not the sort of thing a mountain drifter wore. Even now, torn to pieces, even with dried blood turning most of the shirt into a stiff reddish-brown patch, she could still recognize the exquisite stitching, the rows of thread, so even that only the hands of a skilled tailor in some large city could have made them. She looked from the linen shirt to the thick beard clotted with ice and snow, then to his large calloused hands with cracked knuckles, and a small question kindled in her mind. Who was this man? The rough outer shell like a broken pine in the forest, and that imported linen did not belong to the same person. Yet here they were together, on her bed, bleeding onto her patched quilt. Maeve pushed the question aside. Questions did not save lives, and right now the only thing that mattered was whatever was killing him from the inside. She called over her shoulder, her voice hardening into the tone she used when she would not allow anyone to argue. Cormac, take Bridget to the kitchen corner, sit by the stove, and both of you stay there. Don't come closer. The boy had finished pulling off his wet boots, his face pale and exhausted, but he led his little sister to the stool beside the stove, and Bridget, the 5-year-old girl with 2 messy braids, curled into her brother's lap, her round eyes fixed on the bed without understanding what was happening. Maeve turned back to the man. She peeled the linen shirt away from the wound slowly, because dried blood had glued the cloth to the flesh, and each time she pulled, a crusted layer tore loose with a smell that tightened her stomach, that faintly sweet smell anyone who had ever worked in a hospital had learned to fear. Then the wound appeared beneath the lamp. It was a deep tear high on his chest, just below the right collarbone, the edges swollen and angry red, surrounded by a dark purple halo spreading like ink across paper. This was not a bullet wound. Maeve had seen enough injuries in her life to know the difference. The bullet that had grazed his ribs was only a shallow groove, already beginning to seal, nothing serious. This stab wound was what was dragging him toward the grave, a deep knife thrust driven by the full intention to kill, and it had been festering for days. She laid the back of her hand on his forehead, and then against the skin around the wound, and the fierce heat rising from it made her heart sink. Fever. The infection had entered his blood. If she could not get the poisonous filth out of that wound tonight, he would have no chance of seeing the sun rise, and those 5 paper bills and the gold ring would be nothing but useless things on a corpse she would somehow have to deal with. Maeve stood, both her knees cracking, and began to prepare. She set a large pot of water on the stove, stirred the coals until the fire flared, then placed her smallest, sharpest knife into the water as it slowly heated. She took a spool of thread and a sewing needle from the mending basket, the same needle she used to patch Cormac's boots, and placed it beside the knife. She tore the last clean piece of cloth in the house into narrow strips. Her hands, though cracked and bleeding from the rope, had stopped trembling. Something rose inside her as she arranged those crude tools into a neat line on the stool, pulled close to the bed, something she had thought buried with her late husband. The cold and certain calm of someone trained to wrestle life back from the hands of death. Her hands remembered the things her heart had tried to forget. Maeve looked down at the strange man burning with fever on her bed, drew one deep breath, and knew that the hardest part had only just begun. Maeve needed something strong to wash the wound, and there was not a single drop of alcohol left in her house. She turned to the buffalo hide coat thrown on the floor, searched through its deep pockets with a faint, desperate hope, and her hand touched something hard and cold. She pulled out a flat metal flask the kind men hid inside their coats, and when she opened the cap, the harsh, sharp smell of strong liquor rushed straight into her nose. Bootleg whiskey. The forbidden liquor the whole country was secretly trading, and yet this man carried a full flask of it. A dry laugh escaped Maeve, with no joy in it at all. There was a bitter irony in the fact that this illegal whiskey, the very thing perhaps tied to the reason he was lying here with a knife wound in his body, was now about to become the only thing that might save his life. She poured a little over her cracked hands, the alcohol burning fiercely in the open cuts left by the rope, then clenched her teeth and poured the rest over his festering wound. The reaction was immediate and violent. The man's large body jerked up from the bed, and a deep guttural roar broke from somewhere inside his chest, though his eyes remained tightly shut in fevered unconsciousness. Maeve had expected it. She threw the weight of her body across his uninjured shoulder, pinned him down, and waited until the spasms eased, until he sank again into the burning stillness of fever. Then she picked up the small knife that had been boiled in water. The next part was the part she hated most, but her hands did not allow her heart to retreat. She had to open the wound wider to draw out all the poisoned filth sealed inside it, and she did it with cold concentration, her lips pressed into a straight line, the oil lamp casting her trembling shadow across the wooden wall. Sweat beaded on her forehead, though the room was still cold. She cleaned, pressed, flushed again with the sharp bootleg whiskey, repeating it again and again until that terrible sweet smell began to fade, and the blood coming out turned bright red again, instead of the sickly dark color from before. Only then did she thread the needle. The first stitch pierced his flesh, and the man moved again. But this time it was not a senseless jerk. His left hand, a hand as big as a dinner plate, shot up through the darkness so fast Maeve could not move away in time, and his fingers locked around her wrist. His grip was an iron vise. She felt the bones in her wrist press together, felt her pulse hammer beneath the pressure, and a sharp pain ran all the way to her elbow. Another woman might have screamed. Another woman might have begged. Maeve did neither. She did not hurry. She did not panic. She let the needle hang from the thread, reached back with her free hand and took hold of the heavy iron spoon handle she used to stir porridge in the pot. Then she struck once, firm and precise, directly across the knuckles gripping her. It was not a cruel blow, but it was painful enough for a body, even one drowning in delirium, to understand the message. "Let go," she said, her voice low, even and cold as the frozen creek outside. "I'm trying to keep you alive. Squeeze my hand again, and I'll let you take care of that wound yourself." His fingers trembled, then loosened just enough for her to pull her wrist free. She rubbed the reddened skin, which would be a purple bruise by morning, and looked down at his fevered face. He had not heard her. He did not know where he was, did not know who the woman stitching his flesh back together was. But there was something in the way the whole room seemed to hold its breath around him, even while he lay unconscious, that made Maeve understand this man, whether awake or lost in fever, was used to giving orders, not obeying them, and she understood from that very moment that if he survived the night, what stood between them would be a contest of wills. She returned to the needle. She stitched one careful pass after another, steady, patient, drawing the two edges of skin together with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. When the final stitch was tied and cut clean, she laid a clean cloth soaked with the last of the whiskey over the wound, then bound it in place with the strips of fabric she had torn earlier. Maeve sank down onto the stool, both arms limp with exhaustion, and watched his chest rise and fall a little more steadily than before. She had done everything she could. The rest, she thought, was between him and his own fate. Darkness had swallowed the house whole by the time Maeve finally rose from the stool to see to supper. She lifted the lid from the pot of porridge sitting on the corner of the stove, and the thin steam rising from it told her what she already knew, that there was hardly anything left inside. She scooped out the thickest part, the bit with a little oatmeal settled at the bottom, and divided it between two chipped wooden bowls for Cormac and Bridget. Her own portion she left in the pot, a pale, watery thing she would sip after the children were full and asleep, if she still felt hungry. She carried the two bowls to the children beside the hearth. Bridget held her bowl in both tiny hands, blowing over the hot porridge before she ate, while Cormac hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the nearly empty pot. "What about yours, Ma?" the boy asked, the question he had asked far too many times that winter, the question an 8-year-old child should never have had to worry about. "I already ate," Maeve lied, her voice soft in the way she saved only for her children. "Eat yours while it's hot." She turned away before the boy could look into her eyes, because Cormac was old enough to recognize a lie, and she did not want to make him carry the burden of knowing the truth. While the children ate, Maeve went to the stack of firewood beside the door, and the low anger inside her rose again as she counted the pieces left. That wood should have been enough to get her family through the end of January. She had split every piece herself on afternoons when her back ached as though it were breaking, had counted every stick, every night, so they could survive the winter without burning things that should not be burned. And now she had to throw more wood into the stove, more than she had ever allowed herself, because the man on the bed could not be left cold. His fever needed warmth, and warmth was made from wood, and wood was the survival of her own children burning away into ash and smoke. She placed 2 more logs into the stove, watched the flames lick over them, and hated herself for not leaving him by the creek. Maeve sat down on the floor beside the hearth, her back against the wall, and listened to the sounds inside the little house, the crackle of fire, the scrape of spoons against bowls, and above it all, swallowing it all, was the breathing of the strange man. He breathed heavily, wheezing, each breath pulled in and pushed out like the bellows of a forge, filling the whole space, taking all the air in the cramped room. Maeve found herself hating that sound too. She hated the way it reminded her that there was now another mouth in the house, another body that needed warmth, another life hanging from shoulders already bent too low. She had 2 children to care for. She had not asked for this huge man. She had not asked for the secret he carried, or the knife that had gone into him, or the dangerous world hinted at by the linen shirt and the wad of paper money. She only wanted her children to live. And then, as though that very thought had summoned it, Cormac coughed. Not one single cough, but a long fit, dry and rasping. One spasm after another shaking his thin shoulders until he had to set the porridge bowl down and fold over himself. Maeve was on her feet at once, beside him, one hand on his back, rubbing slow circles the way she did every night. She knew this cough. She knew it would grow worse when the weather was cold, worse still around the hours after midnight and before dawn, and she knew exactly what would ease it. She stood, went to the shelf, and picked up the cough medicine, though she already knew, though she had known the answer before her hand even closed around the bottle. The bottle was weightless in her palm. She tilted it in the firelight, and only a thin streak clung to the bottom, not enough for 1 spoonful, not enough for 1 night. She had scraped the last drops from it 3 days ago. Maeve stood there, holding the empty bottle in her hand, listening to her son cough behind her, and something colder than the wind outside tightened around her chest. Cormac's medicine came from the pharmacy down in town, and buying it took money, the one thing she did not have. Meanwhile, less than 3 steps away from her, in the lining of the coat thrown on the floor, lay a wad of paper bills, large enough to buy her son's medicine, not only for one winter, but for many winters to come. Maeve closed her eyes. She set the empty bottle back on the shelf, very gently, as though afraid of breaking something even more fragile than glass, then turned back to her son, and left that thought hanging in the darkness, not yet daring to touch it. The knock came when the night was already late, 3 heavy, decisive blows falling against the wooden door, and Maeve knew who it was even before any voice spoke. No decent person came knocking on a widow's door in the middle of the mountains at this hour. She felt the blood in her body go cold, but her hands were already moving before fear could freeze her feet in place. She scooped Bridget up as the child was drifting into sleep, signaled to Cormac with a look the boy understood at once without words, and hurried them both into the small back room, the room barely large enough for a narrow pallet and a few trunks. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice urgent but steady. "No matter what you hear out there, don't come out, don't make a sound." She pulled the little room's door shut, slid the bolt into place, then stood still for 1 second in the middle of the house, forcing her heartbeat to slow. Her eyes swept to the man lying on the bed. She had no time to hide him anywhere. All she could do was pull the patched quilt up high, covering his bearded face and bandaged chest, then turn the bed slightly toward the darkest corner, where the oil lamp's glow reached the least. The knocking came again, more impatient this time. "Open the door, Maeve. I know you're in there." She drew a breath, wiped both hands on her apron, and opened the door only wide enough for her body to block the gap, not 1 inch more. Silas Crane stood there on the porch, his coat shoulders dusted with a thin layer of snow, his face gaunt beneath the low brim of his hat. He collected debts for the lenders down in town, and he had a habit of coming at the hours when people were easiest to wound. "It's late, Mr. Crane," Maeve said, her voice flat, neither welcoming nor afraid. "I've got 2 children sleeping." He curled his mouth, his eyes trying to slide past her shoulder into the dark house. "I'm here on my employer's business, not to choose an hour that pleases you. You owe money for your husband's hospital bill, and the deadline is long past." Maeve held her body in the doorway, unmoving, not giving him 1 inch to push through. "I know what I owe," she said. "I haven't forgotten." "Then you also know my employer is losing patience," Silas replied, his voice lowering into a softness more frightening than shouting. "He's been generous. He waited all through autumn. But every generosity has its limit, Mrs. Sullivan. You have exactly 2 weeks. 2 weeks to gather the money, or my employer will come, take the only thing you still own that has value, this land and this house." Maeve felt a chill run down her spine, but she did not let it show on her face. "This is the only roof my children have," she said. "Exactly," Silas nodded, as though that was the very thing that gave his threat its weight. "So I suggest you find the money." His eyes slid once more over her shoulder, pausing for half a second on the bulky shape beneath the quilt in the shadowed corner, and Maeve felt her heart leap into her throat. She stepped fully out onto the porch, pulling the door almost closed behind her, forcing Silas to move back 1 step and forcing his gaze away from the room. "You've said what you came to say," she said coldly. 2 weeks, I heard you. Now leave me and my children alone." Silas looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was the irritation of a man not used to having a woman stand in his way. But she was not begging, not weeping, not doing what he expected from a cornered widow, and her calm left him uncertain what to do next. He tugged the brim of his hat lower. 2 weeks, he repeated, then turned and went down the porch steps, disappearing into the night and snow, his footsteps crunching softer and softer until they were gone. Maeve stood on the porch a moment longer, trembling, and this time she was not sure it was from the cold. 2 weeks. She went back inside, shut the door tightly, slid all 3 bolts into place, then leaned her back against the wood and closed her eyes. She opened the back room for the children, and Bridget rushed into her arms, the little girl not understanding what had just happened, but feeling the fear in the air all the same. Cormac stood there with a face far too solemn for his age, and Maeve knew the boy had heard more than she wanted him to. She held Bridget tightly and reached her other hand out for Cormac, and with her children in her arms, inside a small house where a stranger was dying and an invisible clock had just begun to count down, Maeve Sullivan told herself she would find a way. She always found a way. She just did not yet know how much it would cost. That night, After both children had finally fallen into deep sleep, Bridget curled inside the blanket and Cormac breathing in a steady wheeze beside her. Maeve sat up in the fading firelight to finish a task she had not had time for during the day. The man's buffalo hide coat still lay discarded on the floor, and the blood-soaked linen shirt she had cut from his body hung over the back of a chair, stiff and foul-smelling. She could not leave them that way. In this house, nothing was allowed to go to waste, not even a stranger's cloth, and if that linen shirt could still be used after being washed clean, then it would be one more thing she could make use of. Maeve carried the shirt to the basin beside the stove, dipped it into the lukewarm water that remained, and began to scrub. The dried blood slowly dissolved, staining the water a cloudy brown, and while her hands worked mechanically, her mind drifted toward the coat on the floor, toward the thing she knew was still hidden inside its lining. She had put it back once, out there in the snow, when her heart had still been pounding with shock, but now it was different. Now she had time to think, and that thought was far more dangerous than the impulse by the creek. Maeve wrung out the linen shirt, hung it over a line, stretched near the stove, then sat down on the floor beside the buffalo hide coat, and this time she did not pretend that she had only touched it by accident. She slipped her hand into the lining, found the cleverly cut slit where the wad of money was hidden, and pulled it out. She set the money on her lap beneath the firelight, and for the first time she truly looked at it, counted it. It was more money than she had ever held in her hands in all her life, more than her husband had earned through years of bowing his head underground. And her mind, that cold and practical mind that had kept her alive through 2 lonely winters, began to calculate. She could take exactly what she needed. Not all of it, only a part, enough to close Silas Crane's mouth, enough to stop that 2-week clock from ticking. The man was rich, that much was clear, and a wad of money like this probably meant nothing to him, only loose change that had fallen aside. He would never know it was missing, and if he died, and there was still a very real chance that he would, then there would be no one left to know at all. Maeve sat there with the money in her hands and allowed herself to imagine it, step by step, like someone tracing a route on a map. She saw herself taking the money down to town. She saw herself placing it in the lender's hand. She saw Silas Crane's face when he no longer had any reason to knock on her door. She saw Cormac's medicine bottle full again. All of it was within reach, only one decision away. One small act that no one could blame her for. She had saved the man. She had dragged him up the hill until both her hands were torn open. She had burned her children's firewood to keep him warm. If anyone in this world deserved to take a portion of that money, it was her. That reasoning was so smooth it nearly convinced her. Nearly. But then her eyes lifted from the money and fell on the sleeping man's face, and something inside her came to a halt. If she took this money, then who would she be? Not in his eyes, not in the eyes of Silas Crane or anyone down in town. In her own eyes. All her life, through poverty, through hunger, through the death of the man she loved, through everything that had been taken from her hands, there was one thing she had never allowed to be taken away: the right to look into a mirror and know she was not a thief. If she stole from someone lying helpless in her bed, someone who could not defend himself, could not say yes or no, then the only thing she had left would shatter, and no amount of money in the world could ever buy it back. Maeve lowered her eyes. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. She folded the money neatly. She did not place it back into the coat lining. Instead, she stood, went to the shelf, and took down the old porcelain jar where she kept sugar, the jar that was now almost empty. She placed the money inside, closed the lid, and set it back on the shelf, right out in plain daylight, without hiding it. "I'll give it back to him," she whispered to herself in the dark house. "When he wakes, I'll give back every dollar." And she believed what she said. She almost believed it completely. His fever rose highest in the deepest part of the night, that hollow stretch between midnight and dawn, when the whole world seemed to sag, and even the wind had grown too tired to keep moving. Maeve woke on the floor to the sound of a voice. At first she thought there was a stranger in the house. Then she realized it was him. The man was speaking in his delirium, and his voice, which when awake must have been deep and full of command, had broken into fragments now. Hoarse and strangely young, like the voice of a man stripped of every layer of armor. She pushed herself up, glanced quickly toward the little room where her 2 children slept behind the closed door, then went to the bed and laid the back of her hand against his forehead. His skin was burning hot, dry, and fierce as live coal. and she knew the fever had reached its peak, the deciding hour when he would fall toward life or toward death. She dipped a strip of cloth into the basin of cold water, wrung it out, and laid it across his forehead. He shifted beneath her hand, his head turning faintly from side to side on the thin pillow, and the whispers spilled out again. Nuala. The name broke from his lips, clear among the other tangled sounds, and he repeated it. Nuala, this time softer, more pained, as though the name itself hurt him to speak. Maeve stopped, the damp cloth suspended in the air. It was a woman's name. She did not know who the woman was, his wife, his lover, or someone long dead, but the way he called that name carried something Maeve recognized at once, because she had carried the same thing in her own chest for the past 2 years. It was the ache of loss. She placed the cloth back on his forehead, and he went on whispering, broken sentences rising from some deep place inside him. "I promised," he muttered, his voice choking. "I promised you. I should have been there. I should have come in time." Those words hung in the dark room, and Maeve found herself holding her breath to listen. He was not speaking of money, not of debts, not of the world of imported linen and paper bills hidden inside coats. He was speaking to someone who was gone. He was apologizing. His right hand, the uninjured one, lifted from the bed, trembling, and his fingers opened and closed in the empty air before him, as though he were trying to hold on to something slipping away, or as though he were looking into his own palm and seeing there something he could not wash clean. "Blood," he said, barely making a sound. "On my hands. Won't come clean." Maeve took that grasping hand and gently pressed it back down to the bed. She did not know what he had done, what he had seen, what he had lost. She did not know what dark things this hand had touched in the world he came from. But she knew one thing, and that knowing slipped into her uninvited, shaking the hard judgment she had built around him. This man was not only a burden, not only another mouth to feed, another body consuming firewood, another dangerous secret lying in her bed. He was a human being carrying a wound much deeper than the knife wound in his chest, a wound no needle or thread of hers could sew shut. Someone named Nuala had died, and this man believed he should have been able to stop it, that he had broken a promise, that someone's blood stained his hands. Maeve sat down on the stool beside the bed, the damp cloth in her hand, and looked at his face in the dying firelight. Without the beard and the ice hiding him, with the heat of fever flushing his cheeks, he looked less like a wild animal and more like an exhausted man. She wondered what he had been running from when the bullet and the knife found him out there in the wilderness, far from every city. People did not run to a place like this, unless what they had left behind was more frightening than cold and hunger. A rich man like him should have been inside some warm house, not dying beneath an icy creek bank. Something had driven him all the way here, to the edge of the world, and Maeve had a chilling instinct that it had something to do with the name he had just whispered into the dark. She changed the cloth on his forehead once more, then again and again through the blackest hours of the night, and when the first gray light of dawn finally seeped through the rag-stuffed window, she laid her hand on his forehead again and found it a little cooler. The fever had begun to retreat. He would live. And Maeve, exhausted down to the marrow of her bones, sat there watching the stranger breathe steadily in sleep, no longer certain whether he was a man she should fear, or someone just as broken as she was. The fragile hope of that dawn did not last. By the middle of the next afternoon, as Maeve was chopping the last withered potatoes for supper, she heard that sound from the bed, a rasping breath, hurried and shallow, entirely different from the steady rhythm she had listened to with relief all day. She set the knife down and went to him at once, and the moment her hand touched his skin, her heart sank. The heat had returned, fiercer than the night before, a scorching fever radiating from his body like a banked coal fire. She quickly stripped the bandage from his chest, and what she saw made her swallow back a gasp. The skin around the stitches had swollen again, stretched tight and flushed red, and that terrifying dark purple color had begun to spread once more from the edge of the wound, reaching farther than before. The infection would not let go. It had retreated only to gather strength, and now it had come back stronger, eating deeper into his body. Maeve knew exactly what this meant. She had seen it in the hospital, had seen men far stronger than him, brought down by this very thing, had seen the way it silently poisoned the blood until nothing could be done. She set to work with everything she knew. She boiled a pot of water until it rolled and hissed, then pressed hot poultices over the wound, so hot she could hardly hold them, trying to draw the poison out. She searched every corner of the house for anything she had once used, though she knew her stores were desperately poor. She found a handful of leaves she had picked and dried during the summer, the kind her grandmother had once used for swelling. She crushed them with a little fat and salt into a thick paste, spread it over the wound, bound it in place, and prayed. She did all of it with steady hands and a heart slowly sinking. Maeve stayed awake beside his bed all that evening, changing the hot cloths, wiping his body with cool water to hold the fever down, dripping small spoonfuls of water past his cracked lips. But when night fell, she had to face the truth she had tried to push away for hours. Her grandmother's poultice was not enough. The hot compresses were not enough. The thing killing him had gone too deep, and the rough folk remedies in her hands, though they had saved many lives before, were no better this time than trying to bail out a sinking boat with a spoon. He needed real medicine, the kind that fought infection, the kind only a trained doctor would have, the kind locked in the cabinet of the physician down in town. She sat there in the dying firelight, watching his chest rise and fall with painful effort, and felt helplessness climb into her throat like a bitter taste. Once in her life, she had already had to sit and watch a man she could not save. She had sat beside her husband's bed, had done everything her knowledge allowed, and still she had watched slip from her hands, one breath at a time, until there were no breaths left. She had sworn to herself that she would never have to endure that helplessness again. And yet here it was once more, in this room, with a man whose name she did not even know. Maeve stood. She was not the kind of woman who sat still waiting for death to knock. She went to the window, pulled aside the rag stuffed into the gap, and looked out into the snow-covered night. The town lay many miles down the mountain road, a distance exhausting even on a fair day, and now the snow was thick, the dark was deep, and the cold outside could steal a woman's life as easily as it was trying to steal the life of the man in her bed. She thought of Dr. Abernathy, the kind old physician in town, the only person who might have what she needed, but she had no money to pay for medicine, and her pride shrank from the thought of standing at his door with her hand held out, begging. Then her eyes flicked toward the porcelain sugar jar on the shelf, and a thought crossed her mind quick and sharp as a blade before she could push it away. No, she would not touch that money. She had promised herself she would find another way. Maeve let the rag fall back into place, turned to look at her 2 sleeping children, then at the man burning with fever, and she knew that whatever her pride might say, tomorrow morning she would have to go down the mountain. Maeve set out before dawn had fully broken. Before she left, she gave Cormac careful instructions, entrusting him with the task of changing the cool cloth on the stranger's forehead and watching over his little sister, placing in his hands the responsibility of a man, though he was only an 8-year-old child. "You're the one Ma trusts most," she said, and she saw his thin shoulders straighten beneath the weight of those words. She wrapped herself in every layer of clothing she owned, pushed her feet into boots whose soles were nearly worn through, and stepped out into the skin-cutting cold of early morning. The road down the mountain was longer than she remembered. The snow reached her knees in the low places, and every step was a struggle against the ground that seemed determined to hold her back. The wind lashed her face, making her eyes water until the tears froze into tiny beads of ice along her lashes. Her lungs burned, and her legs went so numb she could no longer feel her feet. But she kept walking, placing one step after another, counting them in her mind so she would not think about the cold, would not think about the distance still ahead, would not think about what she would have to do when she reached town. By the time she finally dragged herself to the edge of town, the sun had risen high, a weak glow behind a sheet of gray cloud. She went straight to Dr. Abernathy's small house at the end of Main Street, and she stood before his door for a long while, her fist raised but not yet knocking, while her pride struggled one last time. She had never begged anyone for anything in her life. She would rather go hungry than hold out her hand. But this was not for herself. She lowered her fist, drew a breath, then knocked. The old doctor opened the door, his silver hair in disarray and his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose, and when he saw her standing there, trembling and covered in snow, he hurriedly pulled her inside. Maeve did not circle around the truth. She told him she was caring for a badly wounded man, that the infection from a stab wound had entered his blood, that her own remedies were no longer enough, and that she had no money to pay him. But she was begging him for medicine that might save that man's life. She did not say who the man was. Dr. Abernathy looked at her over his spectacles, and in his eyes there was none of the judgment she had prepared herself to bear, only the gentle weariness of a man who had spent his whole life watching people suffer. "You were a good nurse," Mrs. Nsett said softly. "I remember." He turned back inside, opened his medicine cabinet, and took out a small packet and a glass bottle, explaining how to use them, the dosage, and how to change the bandage. "Pay me when you can," he said, brushing aside her choked thanks. "Or don't pay me at all. Just save him." Maeve held the medicine close to her chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world, and to her in that moment it was. She thanked him once more, then stepped outside, her heart lighter because she had the medicine, yet still heavy with the debt of kindness that had just been added to her shoulders. She hurried back along Main Street. Her head lowered against the wind, and it was then that she nearly ran straight into a figure stepping out of the general store. She looked up, and her heart tightened. It was one of the men who often went with Silas Crane, a cold-faced man she had seen standing behind him several times. Maeve dropped her head at once, pulled her scarf up to cover half her face, and turned sharply into a side alley before the man could recognize her. She pressed herself against the wooden wall, her heart pounding, and listened to his footsteps pass by and fade away. If he saw her, he would tell Silas she had come down to town, and Silas would wonder what business she had there, would grow curious, would ask questions, and the last thing she needed now was his attention turned toward the house where a mysterious stranger lay. She waited until she was certain it was safe, then slipped out of town by the longer road and began the long climb back up the mountain. The way home was even crueler than the way down. A new snowstorm had swept in, the wind howling as it drove white sheets of snow into her face, erasing even the familiar path. At times she could not see more than a few steps in front of her, and all she could do was follow memory and instinct, one hand clutching the medicine tight inside her coat, the other groping for familiar tree trunks to guide her. She fell twice, struggled to her feet, and kept walking. When she finally saw the faint glow of the oil lamp spilling through the crack of her own door, night had already fallen, and she could hardly feel any part of her body. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and Cormac rushed to her and threw his arms around her, and for the first time in many hours, Maeve allowed herself to breathe. She had brought the medicine home, and 3 days later, after 3 days and 3 nights of tireless care, the fever finally surrendered. Dr. Abernathy's medicine had done what her folk remedies could not. On the morning of the 4th day, when Maeve laid the back of her hand against his forehead, out of a habit that had become instinct, she felt that his skin had cooled completely. The scorching heat reduced to nothing more than the ordinary warmth of a living body. She peeled back the bandage to check, and this time the skin around the stitches had turned a healthy pale pink, the terrifying dark purple halo gone entirely. The wound was healing. He was truly going to live, not with the fragile, threadbare life of the past few days, but with real life, certain life. Maeve eased back onto the stool, and a long breath slipped from her chest, carrying with it a weight she had been holding for days, without allowing herself to set it down. The children were still asleep in the little room, and the house rested in the rare, gentle quiet of a morning no longer ruled by crisis. She dipped the cloth into the basin of water, wrung it out, and began wiping away the beads of sweat still clinging to his forehead, a motion she had made hundreds of times over the past few days, mechanical and without feeling. But this time, now that the danger had drawn back and her hands no longer had to hurry, something was different. She wiped along his temple, where black hair was threaded with silver, then down to his cheekbone, and for reasons she could not understand, her fingers lingered on his skin longer than they needed to. His beard had grown thicker during the days of illness, and beneath it she could feel the hard line of his cheekbone, the warmth of life pulsing beneath the skin. Then Maeve stopped, as though she had touched a piece of heated iron. She snatched her hand back, clenched it in her lap, and her heart gave one strange beat. How long had it been? She sat there, stunned by her own reaction, and the truth slowly rose inside her, cold and clear. It had been 2 years since she had touched a man with tenderness. 2 years since the last time she had laid her hand on the face of her dead husband. Through all those 2 years, her hands had known only work, only hardship, only splitting firewood, wringing out rags, mending boots, and wrestling life from a world without mercy. They had become the hands of a survival machine, and she had forgotten they had once known how it felt to touch someone, not to heal, not to hold up, but simply to touch. That brief moment when her fingers rested against the warmth of the stranger's skin had awakened something in her that she had thought long dead and buried, a loneliness so deep she had never dared look at it directly. She did not like the feeling. It made her feel weak, fragile, like something other than the hard woman she had been forced to become. Maeve rose sharply from the stool, and just then a small voice sounded from the doorway of the little room. "Ma." Bridget stood there, rubbing her sleepy eyes with tiny fists, her 2 braids loosened from a night of sleep. The little girl walked slowly forward, and her round eyes stopped on the face of the man sleeping in the bed, studying him with the fearless curiosity only a child could have. "He sleeps a long time," the child whispered, as though afraid she might wake him. Maeve knelt beside her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's been sick. He needs a lot of sleep to get well again." Bridget tilted her head, considering this with all the solemn seriousness of a 5-year-old, then looked up at her mother with shining eyes. "Is he a sleeping angel, Ma?" she asked. "He's so very big. His wings must be big too." Maeve looked at her daughter, and something inside her chest tightened and warmed at the same time. The innocence in that question, the clear world Bridget still lived in, a world where a mysterious stranger found in the snow could be an angel instead of a threat, made her want to laugh and cry all at once. She smoothed her daughter's tangled hair and tucked a loose strand behind the child's ear. "Maybe so, sweetheart," she said gently, though she knew better than anyone that whatever the man on the bed was, he was no angel. But she could not bring herself to take that small miracle away from her daughter. "Come on," she said, lifting Bridget into her arms. "Let him sleep. We'll go build the fire and make breakfast." The man on the bed woke late that afternoon, but he did not let anyone know. Awareness returned to him slowly, piece by piece, like water seeping through cracks in stone, and the first instinct to rise inside him, the instinct that had kept him alive for years in a world where carelessness meant death, was to stay still. Do not move. Do not open your eyes. Do not let anyone know you are awake until you understand exactly where you are. He kept his breathing slow and even, pretending he was still sunk in delirium, while his mind began doing what it had always done, gathering, assessing, calculating. He listened. The first sound he recognized was the crackle of fire somewhere to his left, close by. A hearth, a stove. Then the moan of wind outside wooden walls. The same wind he had heard in his fever dreams, suggesting a place remote and isolated, somewhere in the mountains and woods. He felt the weight of rough blankets pressing over him, felt the dull ache pulling tight in his chest each time he breathed too deeply, and he pieced those fragments together. He had been wounded. Someone had cared for him. He was alive, though he should not have been alive. And then he heard voices, and it was those voices that confused him most, because they did not fit anything he had ever known. A woman's voice, low and gentle, and 2 children's voices. The woman was saying something about supper, about washing hands, about sitting properly, the ordinary words of an ordinary life he had forgotten long ago even existed. The little girl giggled over something, a clear, unburdened laugh, and the older boy asked something in a voice too solemn and grown for his age. The man lay still in the darkness behind closed eyelids and listened to the sound of a family. He could not remember the last time he had been in a room like this, a room where laughter was not the laughter of drunken men gloating over victory, where voices did not carry the caution, calculation, and fear people always brought to him. In the world he came from, no one spoke around him with such natural ease. People either bowed before him or plotted against him, and he had lived too long between those 2 extremes, until he had almost believed they were all human beings could offer one another. Yet here, only a few steps away from him, was something entirely different. A warmth he could not name, something so simple it hurt him, like a man frostbitten for too long, suddenly holding his hands near a fire, and feeling the sharp pain of hot blood returning. Then the woman began to sing. Her voice was not beautiful, not trained, only a soft tune she hummed to lull her little daughter into an afternoon's sleep, some old lullaby perhaps her own mother had once sung to her. But that plain, unpolished voice slipped into him in a way no refined music in the elegant parlors of Chicago had ever done, and something he had locked away for a very long time stirred faintly inside his chest, just beneath the healing wound. For one moment, only one moment, that powerful and dangerous man allowed himself to be no one, lying nameless in the shadows, warmed by something he had no right to possess. but old instincts never slept completely. Even as his heart was shaken, the cold and watchful part of his mind kept working, still sweeping through the room from behind the closed lids he opened by the narrowest crack. He noted the position of the door and the heavy bolt fastened across it. He noted the old rifle standing in the corner near the stove. He noted the poverty of the room, every patch on the quilt, every crack in the wall stopped with rags. And with the suspicion that had soaked into his blood, he wondered who this woman was, why she had saved him, and most important of all, what she had found inside his coat. Because in his world, no one saved a stranger without a reason, and no one touched a rich and unconscious man without putting a hand into his pockets. He lay there, torn between the strange warmth seeping into him and the cold mistrust that was all he had ever known, and he decided he would go on pretending to sleep a little longer, listening, waiting, until he understood whose hands he had fallen into. He could not pretend to sleep forever. The next morning, when Maeve stepped to the bed carrying a cup of water, she saw that his eyes were open, and this time they were fully awake. They were dark brown eyes, almost black in the pale morning light, and they were watching her with a cold sharpness that made her stop in the middle of a step. There was no confusion of a man waking in a strange place, no fear, no gratitude, only the intent, calculating stare of someone measuring everything within sight, including her. "Where is my coat?" he said. His voice was hoarse from days of disuse, but the low force beneath it was unmistakable, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. It was not a question, it was an order. Maeve stopped a few steps from the bed, the cup of water in her hand, and something inside her hardened. Not one word of thanks for being dragged out of the snow. Not one question about where he was, or who she was, or whose 2 children those were. Just a flat, cold demand, as though she were a servant in his house. "Good morning," she said, her voice dry. "I'm glad to see you're alive, too." His dark brown eyes narrowed. "My coat," he repeated. And what was in it, so he remembered. Maeve was not surprised. A man like this surely remembered every dollar he carried. She set the cup of water down on the bedside trunk, but she deliberately placed it on the far edge, out of his reach while he was still too weak to sit up. Then she stepped back and folded her arms across her chest. "In this house," she said, each word clear and calm, "people ask. They don't order. Even when they're lying helpless in someone else's bed." Something flashed in his eyes, anger mixed with astonishment, the astonishment of a man unused to being refused. He looked at the cup of water, then at her, and she saw him weighing his choice, saw the cold machinery behind those eyes, turning as he calculated what to do with the thin woman in the worn dress, the woman who dared place a cup of water beyond his reach. He tried to push himself up, and instantly his face went pale, the pain in his wound forcing a sharp breath from him before he dropped back down. When he looked up again, there was a small change in his eyes, a reluctant acknowledgement of his situation. "Water," he said. Then, after a silence that stretched as though the word had to be dragged from some deep, hard place inside him, he added, "Please." Maeve picked up the cup, went to him, slipped one hand behind the back of his neck, and lifted his head just enough for him to drink. He drained it, and when she lowered his head again, she sat on the stool beside the bed and looked straight at him. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her for a long while before answering, as if deciding how much to give her. "Rourke," he said at last. Only one name, no surname, and she did not ask for more. "And who did this to you?" she continued, her eyes flicking toward the wound on his chest. Rourke turned his face toward the water-stained boards of the ceiling. "Someone I once trusted," he said, his voice dangerously flat. "A man I did business with." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something in his words that caught Maeve's attention. "I don't know if he acted alone. I don't know who else may be standing behind him. That's why I'm here alone, with no one knowing. Until I know who I can trust, it's better that no one knows I'm alive, not even my own men." Maeve took that in silently. So this man was running, not only from whoever had stabbed him, but from the very people who should have stood on his side. A man rich and powerful enough to carry himself like that, and yet lonely enough that he dared not tell a single soul where he was. Something both pitying and cold rose inside her. "Men don't stab one another over business, Mr. Rourke," she said softly, putting into her own words a truth she had learned long ago. "Men stab one another because of betrayal or fear, and a man who has to hide even from those under his command must be facing both." Rourke turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time, the cold calculation in his eyes slackened for a moment, giving way to something else, surprise perhaps. that this thin woman with flour on her apron had seen through him so quickly. "You're a bitter woman, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "I'm an honest woman," she replied, rising from the stool. Around here, the two look much the same. Over the next few days, Rourke visibly grew stronger. Life returned to him as quickly as it had left him, and before long he could sit up by himself against the wooden wall, then lift a spoonful of porridge to his mouth without anyone's help. But along with his strength, his sharp instinct for observation also returned in full, and Maeve knew it was only a matter of time before he noticed. That morning, she saw his eyes stop on the buffalo hide coat, now washed clean and hanging neatly on a peg near the door. She saw him look at it for a long while, and she knew what he was thinking. Then his gaze shifted to the shelf on the wall, moved over the poor little items arranged there, and came to rest on the porcelain sugar jar. He said nothing. He did not need to. That silence, the way he was fitting the pieces together right in front of her, weighed heavier than any accusation could have. Maeve felt her face grow hot, not with the shame of being caught, but with something deeper, the humiliation of being seen through. She had prepared herself for the fury of a rich man stolen from by the very person he owed his life to. She had already built the words she would use in reply, the defensive ground on which she would stand. But Rourke did not become angry. He only turned those dark brown eyes toward her and spoke in a voice strangely calm. "You found everything in my coat," he said. It was not a question. Maeve straightened. She would not deny it like a coward. That was not who she was. "Yes," she answered, lifting her chin. "I found it." "You thought I would lose my temper," Rourke said, and something almost like amusement passed through his eyes. Maeve did not answer, and he went on, his voice low and slow, as though he were explaining something that to him was as obvious as the laws of heaven. "In the world I live in, Mrs. Sullivan, everything on this earth is a debt." He looked down at his hand, the hand he had stared at in his delirium, as though it were stained. "There are two kinds of debt. Blood debt has to be paid in blood. That's the kind I've lived with all my life. But there is another kind of debt, a debt of mercy, and that kind isn't paid in blood. It is paid in freedom." He lifted his eyes to her. "You did not steal anything from me. You kept back the piece of freedom I owed you from the moment you pulled me out of the snow." Those words hung in the little house, and Maeve felt them loosen something inside her, a knot she had been tightening for days. She stood there for a while, then walked to the shelf, took down the porcelain sugar jar, and carried it to the bed. She did not want that debt hanging between them for even one more second. She turned the jar upside down over the quilt, and the wad of paper bills slid out, followed by the gold signet ring, which rolled once and then lay still on the patched fabric, the metal flashing in the daylight. "I meant to take it," Maeve said, and her voice did not tremble, because she had decided to tell the whole truth no matter how much it hurt her. Not once, but twice. "I sat here in the dark and figured how much would be enough, how I could take it so no one would know. I told myself you were rich, that you wouldn't miss it, that I had saved you, so I deserved it. I had every reason in the world." She stopped and drew a breath. "But I couldn't spend a single dollar. I held that money in my hand, and it was heavy as stone, cold as ash. Every time I looked at it, I didn't see food or medicine. I only saw what I would lose if I took it." She raised her eyes to him. "I'm poor, Mr. Rourke. I'm poor enough that my children go to bed with empty bellies. But I've never been a thief, and I won't begin by stealing from the body of a man who couldn't defend himself." Rourke watched her the entire time she spoke, and when she fell silent, he did not answer right away. He looked down at the money and the ring lying on the quilt, then back at her face, her cracked hands, the dark circles under her eyes, the chin still lifted high despite everything. And in those dark brown eyes, usually cold as slate, something shifted, slowly, like ice beginning to crack beneath the first sun of spring. He had spent his whole life among people willing to cut one another's throats for a small portion of that money. He had never once, in all his life, met anyone who could hold a fortune in her hands and set it down for the sake of something that could not be weighed or measured. "You are a strange woman, Mrs. Sullivan," he said softly, and this time there was no mockery in his voice at all. His forgiveness should have made her feel lighter, but it did not. Maeve stood there beside the bed, the money and the ring laid bare between them, and she realized that an accusation would have been far easier to bear than this. If he had grown angry, she could have fought back. She could have raised the familiar wall, answered anger with anger, and kept intact the hard shell she had spent the past 2 years sharpening around herself. But he did not give her that excuse. Instead, he saw through her, saw even the ugliest part of her, the part that had calculated and wanted in the darkness. And he did not condemn it, and it was that understanding without judgment that did what no attack ever could. It stripped away her armor. She felt naked, exposed, standing there with every truth about herself dragged into the light, and she had nowhere left to hide. She dropped onto the stool beside the bed, suddenly feeling as though her legs no longer had the strength to hold her upright. For a long while, both of them were silent. Outside, the wind had softened, and inside the house there was only the quiet murmur of the fire and the small voices of the two children playing on the back porch, where Cormac was showing his little sister how to line up stones in rows. When Maeve finally spoke, she did not know why she was speaking. She only knew that the silence that understood her had opened a door inside her that she had kept locked for a very long time. "My husband used to say I was stubborn enough to argue with a storm," she said, her eyes on the fire instead of on him. "He said that was why he married me." Rourke said nothing. He only lay still and listened, and there was something in his silence, a complete attention, that made her continue. "He was a miner," she said, "like most of the men around here. They went down into the earth before dawn and came back up after dark, never seeing the sun all day, all so they could earn enough to buy flour and pay rent on a company house. It was a hard life, but it was ours, and we were happy in the way poor people are happy, with small things, with the laughter of children, with having each other." She stopped, and her fingers tightened together in her lap. Then one morning the siren sounded from the mine, that siren every miner's wife fears. When it screams in the middle of the day like that, it means something has happened. Maeve closed her eyes for a moment. "The tunnel collapsed," she said softly. "They told me it happened fast, that the men deep below didn't have time to know what was happening. I don't know if that was comfort or a lie. People say things like that to widows. They dug for 3 days. I stood at the mouth of that mine for all 3 days, with Bridget in my belly and Cormac clinging to my skirt, and I waited. But he wasn't among the men they brought up alive." She opened her eyes, and her voice hardened, the voice she used to keep herself from breaking apart. "I was a nurse. I had treated so many people. But when the person I needed most to save was buried under all that earth and stone, I could do nothing at all. I could only stand there and wait. Afterward, the company took back the house, because the house belonged to them, and a dead man can't dig coal anymore. They gave me 1 week to leave. I brought the children to this abandoned cabin, and I've been here ever since, learning how to survive, learning how to become whatever I had to become." She turned to look at Rourke for the first time since she had begun speaking. "So when I say I know what a dying man looks like, Mr. Rourke, those are not empty words. I've sat beside death before. I lost to it once. I didn't intend to lose to it again on this very bed." Rourke looked at her for a long time after she finished. In those dark brown eyes there was no pity, and she was grateful for that, because pity was the one thing she could not bear. Instead, there was something else, a recognition, as though he were seeing in her the reflection of something inside himself. "You lost someone you couldn't save," he said, and his voice sank lower, carrying a weight she had never heard in him before. Maeve did not answer. She did not need to. And in that moment, between two people who could not have been more different, a poor widow in the mountains and a powerful man from the great city, something was exchanged without the need for another word. Both of them carried within themselves the name of someone dead. Both of them knew what it felt like to stand beside a grave and wonder what they should have done differently. They were both survivors, each in their own way, and for the first time since she had dragged him up from the snow, Maeve looked at the man in her bed and did not see a burden, or a threat, or a dangerous secret. She saw only a human being, just as broken as she was. Silas Crane came back before the 2 weeks were over. He arrived late one afternoon, and this time his knock was no longer 3 decisive blows, but a furious pounding, the sound of a man who had already decided he would not leave empty-handed. Maeve felt her whole body tighten. She had known he would come back, but she had hoped for more time. Her reflexes acted at once, the reflexes she had sharpened since the last visit. She set down the pan in her hand and called the children. "Into the room," she said, her voice low but allowing no argument. "Cormac, take your sister in, close the door, and don't come out until Ma calls." The boy, who had learned from last time that there were moments when questions did not belong, immediately took Bridget's hand and pulled her into the back room, the door closing behind them. Only when Maeve heard the bolts slide into place from inside did she turn toward the front door. But before she could step toward it, a voice spoke from the bed. "Don't open it." Rourke had sat up. More than that, he was trying to stand, one hand braced against the bed frame, his face gone pale from the effort, but his eyes sharp, cold, and fully alert. "Let me," he said. Maeve looked at him, at the man who only days earlier had lain motionless with fever, now forcing himself upright by pure will. "You can barely stand," she said. "I don't need to stand well to speak to a man like that," Rourke answered, and there was something in his voice, a chilling calm, that made her step back without meaning to. He dragged himself toward the door, every step an effort, and motioned for her to stay behind him. Maeve, for a reason she could not explain, obeyed. She moved back into the shadows near the stove, and Rourke drew the bolt and opened the door. Silas Crane had his fist raised to pound again when he stopped short, his hand hanging in the air. He had not expected to see a man here, and certainly not a man like this. Large and looming enough to fill the whole doorway, even while leaning against the frame to keep himself standing. "Who are you?" Silas asked, but the arrogance in his voice had already dropped a measure. "The man paying Mrs. Sullivan's debt," Rourke said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. There was a quiet authority in the way he spoke, the authority of someone who had never needed to shout in order to be heard. "Who are you to interfere?" Silas tried to recover his aggression. "This is between me and her." Rourke leaned forward, only slightly, and lowered his voice into something only Silas could hear. A few sentences Maeve, standing behind him, could not fully catch. She heard only the faint edge of a name she did not know, and a few words about Chicago, about men Silas must have heard of, and about how wise a petty debt collector in a mountain town would be if he understood who he was standing in front of. Maeve did not need to hear every word. She only needed to watch Silas Crane's face. She saw it change right before her eyes, saw the bluster dissolve, saw the blood drain from his cheeks until his face went white as paper. He stepped back once, then again, and the look he gave Rourke was no longer the look of a man collecting a debt, but the look of someone who had just realized what he had nearly stepped on. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I had no idea she was connected to." "You didn't know," Rourke cut in, still in that same even voice. "Now you do. Mrs. Sullivan's debt is settled. You'll go back and tell your employer that, and no one will come to this house again. Is that clear?" "Yes," Silas said quickly, almost stumbling over his own words. "Yes, of course. Sorry for the trouble." He jerked the brim of his hat down, stammered out another apology, then turned and nearly ran from the porch, disappearing into the dusk so quickly it might almost have been comical, if not for the chilling truth behind it. Rourke stayed leaning against the doorframe for another moment, watching Silas vanish. Then he closed the door and turned, and instantly all the strength seemed to leave him. He staggered. Maeve rushed to catch him, one arm going around his broad back to keep him from falling, and she helped him back to the bed, where he dropped down, breathing hard. She stood watching him, and in her mind, the final pieces were quietly fitting together. She had guessed he was powerful. She had known he was rich. But the way a man like Silas Crane had gone pale and fled because of a few quiet words, that authority that did not require a raised fist, told her that the man she had dragged up from the snow was not a merchant, not an ordinary wealthy man. "Who are you, Rourke?" she asked softly, standing beside the bed and looking down at him. "Who are you really?" Rourke did not answer her question that night, but something in the way Maeve had caught him had helped him back to bed without shrinking from the truth that he was a dangerous man, made something inside him waver. And a few days later, when he was strong enough to move around the small house on his own, he told her that it was time. "I sent word," he said. Maeve looked up from where she was kneading dough. "To whom?" "To the only person in this world I still dare to trust," Rourke answered. "A man who was beside me before I became what I am now. I waited until I was sure, until I knew who the traitor was, and whether he had acted alone or whether there was a larger plot behind him. Now I know. They'll come for me any day now." Maeve nodded, and she was surprised to realize that the news did not bring her the relief it should have. This man was about to leave her house, about to give back her bed, her space or peace, and she should have been glad. But she was not glad. The car arrived the next morning, a powerful black automobile that looked strangely out of place against the white snow and the mountains, and it got stuck at the foot of the hill, unable to climb the snow-covered trail. Through the crack of the door, Maeve saw two men in thick coats step out, one of them hurrying up the slope through the snow with worry written all over his face. Rourke had put his clean buffalo hide coat back on, and he was standing by the stove, one hand still held carefully near the chest wound that had only just healed. Before his man reached the house, he turned to Maeve and said the thing she had asked him several nights earlier, the thing he had kept back until this moment. "You wanted to know who I am," he said. "Then I'll tell you, because you deserve to hear the truth from my own mouth. In Chicago, there are men who run the whole city from the shadows, men even the police have learned to fear, men whose names are spoken only in whispers. I am one of them, perhaps the one at the top of them." Maeve said nothing. She had already guessed most of that, but what she had not guessed was what came next meet. Rourke looked into the fire, and his hard face softened in a way she had never seen before. "The name I called in my fever," he said quietly. "You heard it." Maeve gave a slight nod. "Nuala," she said. "My sister," Rourke said, and those two words alone held a whole sea of pain he had locked away for years. "She was the only good thing left in my family. When our parents died, I raised her. I promised her I would always protect her, that I would give her a decent life." He stopped, and his hand, the hand he had lifted in delirium as though it were stained, closed into a fist. "I stepped into this world because of her. For money, for safety, for the kind of power that could shield her from the poverty that killed our parents. I told myself I was doing all of it for her. But that world spares no one. My enemies could not reach me, so they reached her. And on the night she needed me most, I was not there. I was busy with business, busy building the empire I told myself was meant to protect her, and by the time I arrived, it was too late." His voice turned rough and thick. "I promised to protect her, and I broke that promise. That is the blood debt I'll never finish paying." Maeve stood silent, and now she understood. She understood the hand raised in fever, the blood that could not be washed clean, the whispered apology to someone who could no longer hear it. The man before her was not a monster born from greed. He was a brother who had once been poor, who had once loved, who had once made a promise, and who had let pain and guilt shape him into a weapon, into a hunter. "The man who stabbed me," he went on, his voice turning cold again, "was my right hand, the man I trusted most after Nuala. He sold me to the same people who hurt her. I went looking for the truth, and I found it along with a knife." He turned to look at Maeve. "So you see, Mrs. Sullivan, you saved the life of a man most of the world would say was not worth saving." A knock sounded at the door, and a man's voice called Rourke's name from outside, full of worry and relief. His men had arrived. But Rourke did not take his eyes off Maeve, waiting to see the fear appear on her face, the fear he was used to seeing in everyone else. But that terror did not come. Maeve looked at him, and there was no disgust on her face, no fear, only something calm and understanding, the gaze of a person who had seen enough suffering in this world not to rush to judge another person's pain. Rourke signaled for his men to wait outside, and the door remained closed. Inside the little house, only the two of them remained, along with the truth that had just been laid bare between them. "I'll pay off your debt," Rourke said, and his voice returned to the solid tone of a man used to arranging everything. "The hospital debt, everything you owe anyone, will be wiped clean this week. You'll never have to hear another knock like Silas Crane's again." He took one step toward her, and more than that. "You don't belong here, Mrs. Sullivan. You and your children are dying slowly in this place, one winter at a time. The boy needs a real doctor, needs air that doesn't make his lungs seize up every night. I can give him that. I have houses, money, the best doctor's money can bring. I can take all three of you out of here, to a warm place where your children will never have to go to bed hungry again." Maeve listened, and every word he spoke touched a longing buried deep inside her, the longing to see her children fed, to see Cormac breathe without fighting for air, to set down the burden she had carried for 2 years. It was everything she had ever prayed for through those long, freezing nights, and that was exactly why it was dangerous. She stayed silent for a long while, looking at the fire, then lifted her eyes and looked straight into his dark brown ones. "Where does that money come from, Rourke?" she asked. The question made him go still. She went on, her voice steady and clear. "That warm house, those fine doctors, the life you want to give my children. All of it is bought with money you made in the very world that killed your sister. Isn't it?" Rourke did not answer, and his silence was the answer. "I have already buried one man," Maeve said, and her voice was not loud, but every word fell heavy as stone. "I stood at the mouth of that mine for 3 days, and waited for them to bring him up, and they did not bring him up. I know what it feels like to lose a man to something bigger than him, something that swallows him whole. She shook her head. I won't do that again. I won't let my children cling to a man, only to stand beside another grave one day. Because your world spares no one. You just said that yourself. And I won't raise my children on money stained with other people's blood, no matter how hungry they are. I would rather peel bark from trees and feed them that. Those words should have made Rourke angry. Anyone else who spoke to him that way would have lived to regret it. But he only stood there, looking at her, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen before, a bewilderment, as though she had placed before him a problem he had never encountered in all his life. Then what do you want from me? He asked, and for the first time his voice was not the voice of a man giving orders or arranging outcomes, but the voice of someone who truly did not know the answer. Maeve stepped closer to him. I don't want your money, she said. I don't want your house or your doctors, not if the price of them is blood. If you want to help my children, then help as one human being helps another, not as a boss paying off a debt. And if you want more than that. She stopped, and she allowed herself to say the thing she had not dared name inside her heart through all those days. If you want a place in this house, in my life and in my children's lives, then you must first step out of the world that killed your sister. You cannot have both. You cannot take my son to school with one hand while the other is still dipped in blood. You have to choose. She stepped back, and suddenly she felt she had said too much, revealed too much, and she folded her arms as though to protect herself. But I'm not a fool, she said more softly. I know a man like you does not give up an empire for a widow and 2 children in a wooden cabin, so I expect nothing. I'm only telling you my price, and that is a price you cannot buy with money. Rourke stood there for a very long time, the man who was used to reducing everything to numbers in a debt ledger, facing for the first time in his life something that could not be placed on any scale. Rourke did not answer her with words, perhaps because he had no answer, or perhaps because the answer was too large to fit inside a single sentence, while his men were waiting outside the door. He only looked at her for a long while, the look of a man trying to remember something he knew he would have to think about many times. Then he nodded, a slight nod, almost a bow before what she had just said. He turned, stepped to the rickety wooden table in the middle of the house, and slipped a hand inside his coat. Maeve thought he would take out the money, and she had already prepared her refusal. But what he placed on the tabletop was not money. It was the gold ring engraved with the family crest, the object she had found in his coat on that first night, the symbol of everything he had once been. He set it down very gently, right in the center of the table, beneath the daylight falling through the crack in the door. Keep it, he said. Not as money, as a promise that I'll think about what you just said. This ring is what I've worn through all the years I became the man you're telling me to leave behind. If one day I come back here without it on my hand, then you'll know what I chose. Maeve looked at the ring, then at him, and she did not pick it up, but she did not push it back toward him either. She only nodded, and in that silence there was something understood without needing to be spoken. Rourke turned toward the door. He paused at the threshold, the very place where weeks earlier she had rolled his seemingly dead body across, and he looked back at the house one last time. He looked at the stove, the wooden table, the bed where he had wrested his life back from death. He looked at Cormac and Bridget, now standing close to the doorframe of the little room, the 2 children who had grown so used to his presence that they were no longer afraid. And finally he looked at Maeve, the woman who had pulled him from the snow, not because of who he was, but despite who he was, the woman who had held a fortune in her hands and set it down because there was something she valued more than money. Thank you, he said, and those were 2 words she suspected he had not said to anyone in a very long time. Then he stepped out, waded through the snow down to the foot of the hill, where the black car was waiting, and his 2 men helped him into it. Maeve stood in the doorway, each of her children clinging to one side of her skirt, and she watched until the car pulled free of the mud, turned onto the road, and disappeared behind the pines. He was gone. The house suddenly felt wide and silent, but on the tabletop the gold ring still lay there, gleaming in the sun, an unspoken promise, a question left open. In the weeks that followed, winter began to loosen its grip. Ice on the roof started to melt, dripping all day like a clock counting down toward spring, and one morning, when Maeve woke, she realized something that took her a moment to understand because of how tightly it squeezed her heart with gratitude. The house was quiet. Cormac was sleeping, and for the first time in so many nights, the boy's breathing was even, deep and gentle, without a single cough tearing through the darkness. Her debt, just as he had promised, had been paid in full by a stranger down in town, and for the first time in 2 years, the shadow of Silas Crane no longer hung over her threshold. She did not know whether Rourke would return. She did not know what path he would choose, or whether a man like him could truly step out of the world that had made him. But she knew that she had not sold the most precious part of herself in exchange for ease, and that no matter what happened, her children would grow up knowing their mother was an honorable woman. And sometimes, she thought, as she looked at the ring still lying on the table, that was already a wealth greater than anything money could buy. Maeve Sullivan's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's dignity can never be measured by the amount of money they hold in their hands, but by what they refuse to trade away, even in their hungriest hour. Kindness given without calculation can touch even hearts that seem hardened beyond reach, and no one, no matter how deeply lost, is without the chance to choose their path again. Sometimes the most precious thing we can give another person is not money, but the faith that they can still become someone better. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day you can hear more meaningful and compelling stories. How do you feel about this story, about Maeve's choice, about Rourke's unfinished promise? Do you believe he'll return without the ring on his hand? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear what you think. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.